So let's try to do some basic investigation into Heidegger's work with the help of Nietzsche, just allowing Nietzsche to play presumptively, we never know what will happen, a secondary role. We can't assume from the outset that something could be said about Heidegger's basic thinking in an intelligible language or in our current language, or that anything can be said without the decisive experiences which Heidegger had and then which he discussed throughout his life and his philosophy. Maybe those experiences will remain inaccessible to us, and his keywords will and their semantic fields will never be more than academic exercise. But on the other hand, maybe we could light into his way of philosophizing and what he thought. The first step would be, I think we don't go too far wrong when we just as a starting place, we think of the fictionalism of George Berkeley, which is universally, maybe, actually I've never seen anyone present it correctly, but which is generally, and for a long time, been misrepresented, especially out of, I think of Marianne Talbot, Oxbridge philosopher, but it's generally and presented in a undergraduate type of 101 way, and then the professors continue to repeat the 101 way throughout their lives, and moreover a way that's fatally mistaken. So, but the idea in Berkeley, if we go through that, maybe we get a little bit towards what Heidegger's thinking is. One, just as in Husserl, we could see it helps us to think about that too, and then we'll try to superimpose Nietzsche. What Berkeley says is, for instance, the cow is in the barn. So what's meant is that, think for a second and remember there were some guys before the Kyoto School actually got started in Japan, like the first Japanese who studied Western philosophy really seriously came out with the opinion, as it were naively, what the Westerners mean by reason is what the Zen koans are about. So, which is kind of an odd thing to conclude, but I think the reason is when we look at things like this thought, which we can only sort of access through thought, the cow is in the barn. What does Berkeley mean by that? His notion is common sense is correct. The cow is in the barn, but what secures it being there? His answer is the esse percipe, understood as God as being sort of a super being, super transcendentalism from the point of view of Zizek, a super being, and this super being is what it does is it perceives. So even though none of us are there to hear the sound of the cow moo when nobody's there, except the cow itself, but okay, let's say the tree which has no ears. Let's keep that in mind at the same time. But that's the same thought that Berkeley is having here. Common sense says the tree, when it falls in the forest, makes a noise, even though nobody's there. And this is the same thought that science naively interprets back to the time of the Big Bang. It's like, oh yeah, you see, it was all there, and it was before there were any beings that even had senses or whatever. So we tend to naively thrust ourselves back into it, or we don't even have to go back in time. Again, the cow is in the barn, meaning nobody's there to observe it, but common sense says it's still there. If you start just with that, but with in George Berkeley's account, he has to have God observing it. So there's still the dualism of the consciousness of God observing the cow. At Heidegger, he's just saying it's just a being. And then there's this thing, but that's the being of the cow, that's the being of the barn. And it's there, and so for instance, you could think of directing yourself, say you were that farmer in your house, and then you said the cow is in the barn, and then you could think of going to the barn, directing yourself to the barn. You're not directing, and then Heidegger's claim is you're not directing yourself towards a representation of the barn as against the real barn, but you're representing yourself to the being. You're referring yourself to the being. You could suddenly get up and go to check on the cow. You're referring yourself to that being. And what you're thinking of when you refer yourself to the being is that actual being. But then against this, Heidegger says, aside from the beings, there's also being. I guess the first hint to this thought is the thought of the world, and the world, where, so for instance, in Heidegger's book on why I stay in the provinces, it's not a book, it's like it's a short statement on why I stay in the provinces, rather than accept the call to go to Berlin, to the more access to publishers or something. Heidegger's saying, basically he's saying when he was young, and all he understood is this sort of Alamaic world, this sort of southern German, non-Prussian world in a certain way, of the peasants of that region. The incursion of learning about all this, basically, it was a Catholic region. The South was mostly Catholic, and it was brought in only after the Franco-Prussian War. Heidegger was born in 1889. That's sort of a moment, I think, where he becomes aware of being. But then he also becomes aware of, at the same time, that these beings, in which the sort of transformation is registering of the Unheimlichness and the Heimat, mixing together and becoming in a questionable state. Then he has this other direction of just being and beings, which is more like what he's talking about with the reciprocity implied by the notion that the proximity of Denken and Donken, or of thinking and thinking. So first there's this letting be that allows us to. So again, in Husserl, so first let's superimpose Husserl sort of over the attempt to access the beings. In Husserl, of course, he's claiming that he's looking for the thing itself. It's a bit confusing, because if I wanted to say das Ding an sich, but it's like it's not really straightforwardly the Kantian problem that he's dealing with, because the Kantian problem, thing in itself, means the problem of primary and is sort of stimulated by the problem of primary and secondary qualities, and then by the Humean problem. But in Husserl kind of goes right to the source. A football game. Or they're preparing for it. In Husserl he starts with Descartes. He starts directly with Descartes' omnibus dubitandum. But it's sort of like what's Husserl? Husserl's attitude towards does the tree in the forest make a sound? He sort of doesn't face up to that head on. I think it's like that's why he seems as though, yeah, his whole thing is to go from this so-called Natureinstellung to the theoretical attitude, so-called natural attitude, theoretical attitude. And yeah, there's kind of an implication that even when these so-called representations aren't being represented by being, the thing itself is there in the place of them. So in that sense, there's a transcendental idea in the place. Yeah, so you could see in Husserl, to say the cow is in the barn means the cow itself is in the barn. Whatever that may mean. And then if you were there observing it, that would be the so-called representation. There's kind of there's just some sort of search directed at the question that never, it's developed, I think, in say, Max Scheler, quite a bit. But it's sort of, for Husserl himself, he doesn't sort of, this is where Heidegger says Husserl is sort of fled in the face of the dread of being, his flight from that question. He doesn't really let it look into his face. I don't feel like that does Husserl full justice, but let's look at another. I think it helps sort of situate the way Heidegger's thinking of beings rather than either the perception version of God receiving them in Esse Percipi in Berkeley, or the some kind of transcendentalist version, or Husserl's Cartesian transcendentalism, as it were. But let's try to do sort of Nietzsche there. Nietzsche is, so far as he starts with Schopenhauer's will and then says Schopenhauer is too naive about the question of the will, it's sort of like he's saying, okay, there's the being of beings question, just like for Berkeley, it's as though the being of beings were being said to be all about perception. So there's this super being called the being of beings, this sort of Zizek super being. Zizek worships Hegel, and Hegel is the first one to really push this notion of the being of beings as this super being that is becoming in a special way that the nous disappears into at the absolute moment. And thereby he simply posits that instead of nous intuiting the objects, Anschauen, or the ideas, he simply throws it inside he throws the being and being inside us and makes us into the sort of the God being, and therefore at the absolute moment, and therefore the sort of hubristic claims of Kassenstein and Fukuyama, this sort of being puffed up, as Jung would call it, being puffed up with having the truth. And so in Nietzsche is saying sort of there is, and Nietzsche exhibits that in some weird sense, doesn't he too? But he's always pushing this Übermensch and sort of saying they have to be great or something, as though it were a sign of lack of equilibrium even. And for him, the being of beings takes on this character that we've been sort of mapping out. But how does that work with the question of perception? So that's interesting. I don't know. Nietzsche doesn't necessarily deal all that much with either the question of primary and secondary qualities, except to, I guess he absorbs them in the perspectivalism view, for instance, in the truth and lies in an extramoral sense, the super metonymic field whereby he's describing sound being described by minute writings on a moving field of sand, and that being then transferred into some other form, and then you could see it would get complicated. There's this metonymic transfer, and then there's some form of ultimately a claim of some sort of blind movement of some kind, and in a way, but it's much more directed towards a physical picture of causality, or in that direction, than either Hegel or Schopenhauer are more directed towards something that seems very abstract, in which Nietzsche ridicules as the last disappearing vapor, in terms of the concept of being. So we should try to formulate the question of ontological difference in such a way that we could directly then force ourselves to say whether it's cogent or not. But at the same time, it's hard to know if we actually have it, if we've actually caught it in the Socratic sense of being on the hunt, and then we're trying to hunt for the truth. So it's we shouldn't be too ready to declare it a false avenue of invasion. Okay, so let's keep trying at that. I think, this Heidegger as in the, why I say in the provinces is kind of helpful, because it shows the Spaltung sort of idea that through juxtaposition you start to become aware of something that you weren't aware of, and in that case he becomes aware of, in a certain sense, beings in these different lights, which are sort of like culture shock, but it makes him aware of the question of being.